All right. So, a few days ago, I watched Eternals, the new Marvel movie, and I have quite a few thoughts on it. As per usual, I haven't really mapped out my thoughts in any sort of particular order, so per usual, this video is going to kind of be all over the place. And I guess I'll start by first of all saying I did enjoy this movie, which I guess puts me in the minority. I thought it was a perfectly enjoyable Marvel movie. It's definitely not my favorite Marvel movie by any stretch of the imagination, but I also don't think it's near the bottom of my list in terms of the MCU either. I'd put it somewhere pretty square in the middle. When they started writing this movie, they had a choice of, these characters that we're about to watch this movie about have been around on Earth for thousands of years. So they had to decide, are we going to write a movie where we talk about what have the Eternals been up to throughout history and what were they doing during the events of what we have watched in the MCU, or were they going to have the Eternals, take place more in the present timeline and then have them be kind of the next step that leads the next phase of Marvel movies. They went with the latter. Now, in order to make us care about the characters, though, we need some backstory, which they do in the form of flashbacks. So this movie does take place predominantly in the present day MCU timeline, but we do get a lot of flashbacks, which I think comes with positives and negatives. Of course, it's a great way to show some backstory and give some character development. However, at the same time, there are certain times, and this is just about flashbacks in general, that when movies make frequent use of flashbacks, where I sometimes find myself getting either super invested in the present timeline or super invested in the flashback, and then when they switch back to whatever the opposite one is, I kind of have to remember what was going on, and sometimes that can get kind of disappointing to me and disrupt the flow. So that may have happened in this movie. I don't think it was a huge issue though, but they do make pretty extensive uses of flashback in this movie. I thought the acting was great, particularly from Richard Madden. Now, he's not necessarily the main character, but he is featured predominantly in the movie. I thought all the characters were performed pretty well. I did think there was, going into this movie, a potential danger that Angelina Jolie could get a little, she could become the unintentional focus of the movie, but I thought she just blended in with the rest of the cast, which was really nice to see. The effects in this movie look great. The cinematography is awesome. I will say that this does fall victim to kind of the traditional Marvel formula where the last sort of half an hour to 45 minutes are a big CGI blowout fest, which the effects in the final half an hour didn't look bad. Some of the green screen is kind of noticeable. Now, to be fair, I do notice the green screen in most Marvel movies. It's never a distraction. It never takes me out of it, but you do notice it a lot. And I definitely noticed it here. But again, not that it really took away anything from the rest of the final battle, which was pretty mesmerizing to look at. I guess if I had to point out my main issue with the movie, it's this. And I may get slightly spoilery here, so I'm just going to put on the bottom of the screen, I guess somewhere, a soft spoiler alert. And then, so if you want to just mute this part, I'll put it back on the screen when you're good to watch it again. So we know from the promotional material for this movie, particularly the trailers, that the Eternals have been on Earth for thousands of years, and that at some point they decided to split up and kind of go their separate ways. In this movie, during one of the flashbacks, we see what prompts them to split up. During one of the flashbacks, we see why they decided to go their separate ways. And this is where the slight spoiler kind of comes in. In the trailer, we know that in the promotional materials, we know that their mission on Earth is just you can't interfere with the human kind of evolution. You just have to let it go. And the conflict comes when some of the characters start to kind of have a moral conundrum, we're watching these humans kind of destroy and kill themselves throughout history. It's kind of taken its toll. And then during one of the events that they're watching humanity commit atrocities against each other, the leader goes, all right, you're free to go your separate ways. And I have no issues with that. I think that actually touches on a pretty deep theme that I can appreciate. What bothers me, though, is that at the beginning of this movie, the initial event that occurs that prompts a couple of the Eternals to decide that they need to get back together is so, I get that it could be important to them, but it's so, minute compared to what we've seen in the MCU that it didn't make any sense to me. And this is the last kind of light spoiler thing I'll say. The event that causes them to realize they need to get back together is they come across a deviant, which they believe they've been non-existent for a long time, and this deviant is able to heal itself from battle, which they hadn't been able to do before. Okay, this is kind of the end of the non-spoiler section. If you weren't watching or if you had it muted, you can come back. So we have that event that makes them realize they need to get back together, which compared to them having been around when Thanos is trying to literally erase half the universe, and when we see that these Eternals, as they are kind of reunited, that the Eternals have been using their powers in some capacity to benefit themselves or those around them, it just didn't make sense to me that Thanos wouldn't be a higher threat level than the thing that happens at the beginning of this movie that prompts them to get back together. Like, surely they would have seen Thanos. Surely they would have seen the news coverage of Tony Stark being abducted by a floating donut, right? And then it would have been like, oh shoot, this is serious. We should probably do something about this, because we've all been kind of sitting around for a while, using our powers to help ourselves, but not humanity like we were supposed to, even though we decided not to. It didn't really make sense to me. And sort of keeping along those lines, I would say that this movie, although it's not the like quote unquote different Marvel movie that people kind of expected, to me it is the most distant from all the rest of them. In a lot of the other MCU movies, there are either Easter eggs or references or cameos to various other events or characters in other MCU movies, which can serve to do a couple things, both positive and negative. To me, as a viewer, it makes me feel rewarded sometimes when they name drop someone, or you see something on a TV screen in the movie that's referencing another event from a different movie, or another character makes a cameo. Like, it makes me feel rewarded as a fan for having invested so much time into these movies to then see it kind of come back and like, oh, that's cool, I know what that is. But at the same time, if you have too much of that, it can kind of bog down the movie, and you're left with kind of like a Black Widow situation where every 2 seconds they're name dropping a Marvel character name, and it can get kind of overwhelming. In this movie, you get Thanos name dropped maybe twice, Iron Man and Captain America and the Avengers name dropped maybe once, but apart from that, there is no other connection that this has to any other of the MCU movies, apart from existing in the same universe, which, again, doesn't maybe make me feel as rewarding as if they had maybe, like, as I mentioned earlier, these Eternals have been around for thousands of years. Surely they could have found like one scene to put like some news coverage in of, like in one of the flashbacks of one of the other events we've seen. Like, I don't think that would have been too much to ask for. At the same time, at some point you have to move the plot forward. The Infinity Saga has already happened. You do want to acknowledge it, but you also have the next main plot that's happening. And this movie was clearly a springboard for, this is like, I think, the first Phase 4 movie where, all right, we're done with the Infinity Saga, we are moving on. So that was just something that I noticed. I think lastly, I'll touch on this. I do struggle to see why this movie is getting such bad reviews. I read an article that had a pretty interesting theory. So I mentioned a few minutes ago that a lot of people thought this would be a really like different and unique Marvel movie for various reasons, whether that was because the trailers looked like it was going to be super unique or different, or because Chloe Zhao, the director, had just won an Oscar for directing Nomadland, which is a more indie film, and people thought she would bring a more uniqueness and kind of a unique tone and voice to this movie. And I think a lot of people, at least according to this article, which I do kind of agree with, found that this movie really isn't different from any Marvel movie. It follows the mold. There's some character development throughout. There's a main issue, and then at the end, there's a huge CGI fight, and then that's kind of the end. And so, again, I enjoyed the movie. It's not my favorite. It's not my least favorite. I definitely don't think it's getting. I don't think it deserves all the hate and negative press that it is getting. Yeah. So in the end, I enjoyed Eternals. It's not a perfect movie. There were a lot of different characters that they had to balance. Some of them were more developed and fleshed out than others. In the end, though, I had a good time, and if you've seen all the Marvel movies up to this point, I don't see why you wouldn't enjoy this one. Okay, so Marvel's Eternals, have you seen it? If so, please let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. Thank you so much for watching, and be sure to stay tuned for more.